Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The first-class seat that sparked a storm. Captain Adrian Coleman was looking forward to his rare day off, a chance to trade the rigid discipline of the cockpit for the quiet luxury of first-class travel. Today, he wasn't commanding a plane but simply enjoying the journey from New York to San Francisco as a passenger. He dressed casually in a crisp white polo shirt and dark jeans, hoping to blend into the crowd. However, Adrian, with his tall frame and confident gait, naturally drew attention. His warm brown skin glowed with a slight sheen from the humid summer air outside, a stark contrast to the icy chill of the airport terminal. Adrian strolled through the first-class boarding lane with his carry-on in tow. He smiled politely at the attendant scanning tickets, then tucked his boarding pass into his pocket as he stepped into the spacious cabin. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the soft leather upholstery, welcoming him to his window seat. Settling in, he pulled out a book he'd been meaning to read for months, Lift Every Voice, Stories of Trailblazing Aviators, a collection of anecdotes about pioneers who had transformed aviation against incredible odds. The hum of boarding passengers filled the air as Adrian sank into his seat, enjoying the rare opportunity to relax. He was vaguely aware of glances from other first-class passengers. A black man traveling in first class wasn't unheard of, but it still sparked curiosity among some. Adrian was used to it. After years of breaking barriers in aviation, he knew what it meant to defy expectations. As he adjusted his seatbelt and prepared to immerse himself in his book, a petite blonde flight attendant with sharp blue eyes approached him. Her name tag read Emily. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her smile tight but professional. "May I see your boarding pass?" Adrian raised an eyebrow but complied, retrieving the slip from his pocket. Emily examined it closely, then looked at Adrian, her expression hard to read. "Sir, it appears there's been an error with your seating assignment," she said, her tone light but edged with something unsettling. "This seat is reserved for our premium passengers. I'll need to ask you to move to the economy section." Adrian blinked, his mind racing. He knew this seat was his, he'd booked it weeks ago, paid full price, and double-checked before boarding. "There must be a mistake," he said, keeping his tone calm and polite. "This is my assigned seat. My ticket clearly states so." Emily hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she doubled down. "I understand, sir, but it's possible there was an overbooking situation. We need this seat for another passenger." Adrian sat back, considering his options. He'd encountered subtle discrimination before, but rarely this blatant. He took a steadying breath. "I'll remain here until the captain clarifies the situation," he said firmly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. Emily's professional smile faltered. "I'll speak to the captain," she said curtly, pivoting sharply on her heel. Adrian watched her retreat down the aisle, whispering to another crew member, her gestures animated. He could feel the eyes of fellow passengers on him, some curious, others judgmental, and a few sympathetic. He turned his focus back to his book, but the words blurred as his mind churned. Adrian had fought for every inch of his success. From being one of the first black cadets at a prestigious flight academy to earning his captain's stripes, he had shattered barriers at every turn. He had faced skepticism, condescension, and outright racism, yet he persevered. As the minutes ticked by, Adrian couldn't help but reflect on the systemic biases that lingered in subtle and overt ways. He had no intention of making a scene, but he also wouldn't tolerate being dismissed. Emily returned after a few minutes, her expression strained. "Sir," she began hesitantly, "the captain is busy with pre-flight preparations, but I can assure you that we'll resolve this once we're airborne. For now, I'll need you to move to economy." Adrian met her gaze steadily. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait to speak directly with the captain." Emily stiffened, clearly unaccustomed to passengers challenging her authority. "If you don't comply, sir, I'll have no choice but to involve security." Adrian's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about principle, dignity, and the countless moments of silent endurance that people like him faced every day. Go ahead, he said simply, his tone unwavering. The murmur of passengers around him grew louder. A middle-aged woman across the aisle leaned in, whispering, "What's going on?" Adrian offered her a reassuring smile, but said nothing. He wouldn't let this moment devolve into chaos. Moments later, a tall man in a crisp uniform strode into the first-class cabin. His salt-and-pepper hair and commanding presence immediately caught Adrian's attention. The man glanced at Adrian, his eyes widening slightly in recognition before shifting to Emily. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice low but firm. "Would you mind coming with me to resolve this misunderstanding?" Adrian stood, towering over Emily, whose face had paled. As he followed the man toward the front of the plane, he could hear the whispers behind him growing louder. It wasn't until they reached the galley that the man turned to him and spoke with quiet urgency. "Captain Coleman, I deeply apologize. I had no idea you were on board. We'll address this immediately." Adrian sighed, his frustration tempered by the man's genuine remorse. "It's not just about me," he said. "This is about ensuring every passenger is treated with respect." The man nodded solemnly. "I'll take care of it." As Adrian returned to his seat, the cabin was abuzz with speculation. Little did the passengers know that this incident would soon transform into a powerful moment of reckoning and redemption for everyone on board. A cabin divided and a stand for dignity. As Adrian Coleman returned to his first-class seat, the cabin was no longer merely a place of quiet luxury. It had become a theater of silent tension. The whispers that had trailed him down the aisle like shadows now buzzed louder, transforming the once tranquil space into a hive of curiosity, unease, and conjecture. Adrian eased back into his seat, his posture as calm as ever, though inside, his frustration simmered. He noticed Emily standing stiffly by the galley, whispering furiously with another flight attendant. Her body language betrayed her unease, and Adrian couldn't help but wonder what was being said. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored suit leaned toward Adrian. He had a gruff demeanor and a curious look in his eyes. "Excuse me," he began, his voice low. "Is everything all right? I couldn't help but overhear." Adrian turned to face him, offering a polite nod. "Just a misunderstanding," he replied evenly. "It's being addressed." The man gave a tight smile. "Misunderstanding or not, they had no right to treat you that way," he muttered before sitting back in his seat. Others in first class exchanged glances, some nodding subtly in agreement. The tension was palpable now, the energy in the cabin shifting. Adrian could feel it, a mix of sympathy, guilt, and quiet indignation. Yet, there were still passengers who avoided his gaze entirely, their silence as telling as any words. The aircraft had yet to push back from the gate, and Adrian could sense the crew scrambling to resolve the situation without causing further delay. The captain, Captain Teresa Bryant, as Adrian recalled from the boarding announcements, had yet to make an appearance. He respected her as a fellow professional, but wondered how she would handle this delicate moment. As he waited, Adrian turned his attention back to his book, though he couldn't focus on the words. Memories of his own journey to becoming a captain surfaced unbidden. He thought of the countless times he had been overlooked, doubted, or outright dismissed. There had been the flight academy instructor who once told him, "You'll have to work twice as hard to prove you belong here." At the time, Adrian had taken the words as a challenge. Years later, he realized it had been less of a motivational statement and more of a blunt acknowledgement of systemic bias. And yet, he had persevered. He had flown through countless hours of training, studied relentlessly, and climbed the ranks. Becoming a captain wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a statement. It was proof that someone like him could not only belong but excel in a space where few expected him to succeed. Adrian's thoughts were interrupted when the cockpit door opened, and Captain Bryant emerged. She was a tall woman with an air of authority and a calm demeanor. Her dark blue uniform was immaculate, and her eyes scanned the cabin with practiced precision before landing on Adrian. "Captain Coleman," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the surrounding passengers. "May I have a word with you?" Adrian stood, nodding politely as he followed her toward the galley. Emily was nearby, her face pale and her expression tense. Another flight attendant, a younger man with kind eyes, stood a few feet away, clearly unsure of how to intervene. In the privacy of the galley, Captain Bryant turned to Adrian. "First, let me apologize for this situation," she began. "I was just made aware of what happened, and I'm deeply sorry for any inconvenience or offense caused." Adrian met her gaze, his own expression calm but firm. "I appreciate the apology, Captain Bryant, but this isn't just an inconvenience. It's about how I was perceived and treated based on assumptions." Bryant nodded, her expression serious. "I understand, and I'll address this with my crew immediately. But if I may, I'd like to ask how you'd like to proceed. We can offer a formal apology over the intercom, or we can handle this more privately." Adrian hesitated, weighing his options. A public apology might feel performative, but a private resolution could allow the issue to be quietly swept under the rug. Neither option felt entirely satisfactory. "What I want," he said finally, "is for your crew to understand why this happened and to ensure it doesn't happen again, not just to me, but to anyone." Bryant's expression softened. "Understood. I'll speak with them personally and ensure this becomes a teachable moment." Before the conversation could continue, a voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, Captain," said a passenger who had wandered up from economy. It was the middle-aged woman who had leaned over earlier to inquire if everything was all right. "I don't mean to intrude, but I think everyone on this plane deserves to know what's going on." Bryant turned to the woman, her brows furrowing slightly. "Ma'am, I assure you we're handling the situation." The woman shook her head, her hands gripping the edge of the nearest seat. "I don't think this should be handled quietly. That man," she said, gesturing toward Adrian, "deserves more than just a quiet apology. We all saw what happened, and if this airline stands for fairness, then it should address the issue openly." Adrian was surprised, but also touched by her candor. He hadn't expected anyone to speak up on his behalf, let alone someone who didn't know him. Captain Bryant hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Very well. Let's address this." She turned and strode back to the front of the cabin. Adrian and the woman followed, and soon, all eyes were on the cockpit door as Bryant picked up the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice echoed throughout the plane, "I'd like to take a moment to address an incident that occurred during boarding. It's come to my attention that one of our passengers, Captain Adrian Coleman, was asked to move from his assigned seat under circumstances that were both unfair and unacceptable." A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. Adrian stood near the aisle, his heart pounding as Bryant continued. "On behalf of the airline and the crew, I'd like to apologize for this mistake. Captain Coleman is not only a valued customer but also a fellow pilot. More importantly, he is someone who, like all of you, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of his appearance or background." Bryant's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Adrian could feel the weight of the moment, the unspoken acknowledgement that this wasn't just about him but about the broader issues of bias and discrimination. The passengers began to clap, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Adrian felt a surge of emotion he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't the resolution he had expected, but it was a step in the right direction. As he returned to his seat, several passengers reached out to shake his hand or offer words of support. Even Emily approached him, her face flushed and her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. I didn't realize who you were." Adrian gave her a small, forgiving smile. "It's not about who I am. It's about making sure no one else has to go through this." Emily nodded, her shoulders sagging with relief. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, Adrian settled into his seat, his book open on his lap. The atmosphere in the cabin felt lighter now, as though a storm had passed, leaving behind a clearer sky. But Adrian knew that the journey wasn't over, not just for him, but for everyone. This moment was a reminder that the fight for dignity, fairness, and respect was ongoing, and every small victory mattered. The lessons we carry. The plane had taken off, and a hum of calm had settled over the cabin, though the events before departure lingered in everyone's minds. Adrian sat in his first-class seat, gazing out at the endless sky as it stretched beyond the window. The quiet serenity of the view contrasted sharply with the turbulence of emotions he felt inside. As a pilot, Adrian had spent countless hours commanding aircraft at this altitude. The sky was familiar, almost like a second home, yet today it felt different. Sitting on this side of the cockpit door, stripped of his uniform and the authority it represented, he'd been reminded of a harsh truth: perception often overshadowed reality. Adrian closed his book, no longer in the mood for reading. His thoughts drifted back to his earliest days in aviation. He remembered his first flight school instructor, a no-nonsense woman named Carla Torres, who had drilled into him the importance of preparation, perseverance, and professionalism. Carla's words echoed in his mind now: when people doubt you, let your excellence speak louder than their prejudice. Today, his excellence hadn't been enough. Or perhaps it had been, but only after the damage had been done. Across the cabin, the atmosphere among the passengers remained charged. In first class, the murmurs had subsided into reflective silence. A few passengers glanced at Adrian now and then, as if trying to reconcile the man they had silently judged with the dignified individual who had carried himself with such composure. In economy, however, the situation was still a topic of animated discussion. "I can't believe they asked him to move," one man whispered to his seatmate. "And he's a pilot, of all things," the other replied. "I don't think it's just about that," said a young woman sitting near the aisle. Her voice was quiet but firm. "It's about how we see people. If he hadn't been a pilot, would anyone have stood up for him? Would anyone have cared?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable but poignant. In the galley. Emily stood near the galley, leaning against the counter and clutching a steaming cup of coffee she hadn't yet sipped. Her hands trembled slightly as she replayed the events in her mind. She had made an assumption, a wrong one, and it had spiraled into something much larger than she'd anticipated. "Emily," a voice startled her from her thoughts. It was Captain Bryant. Emily stood straighter, her professional mask slipping into place. "Captain," she said, her voice strained. Bryant studied her for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Walk with me," she said. Emily followed the captain into the crew's resting area. Once the door was closed behind them, Bryant spoke. "I want to know what happened. The truth, not the sanitized version." Emily hesitated, her face flushing. I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw him sitting in first class, I thought he didn't belong there." Bryant nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "And why did you think that?" Emily's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "Because of his appearance," she confessed. "I know it's wrong. I didn't mean to. I just—" Bryant raised a hand to stop her. "You did mean to. Not consciously, maybe, but you acted on a bias you didn't question. That's the problem, Emily. It's not enough to apologize after the fact. You need to confront the assumptions that lead to these moments." Emily's voice cracked as she replied, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Bryant's expression softened. "I know you didn't. But intentions don't undo the harm caused. Learn from this. Be better. Not just for him, but for every passenger who walks onto one of our planes." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. A conversation in first class. As the flight progressed, Adrian noticed the man across the aisle, the one who had initially spoken to him, leaning forward again. "Captain Coleman," the man began, his voice hesitant but earnest. Adrian turned, giving him his attention. "Yes? I just wanted to say, I admire how you handled yourself earlier. You showed more grace than I think I could have." Adrian smiled faintly. "Thank you. But grace doesn't always come easily. It's something you learn after years of experience, and sometimes, necessity." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's a shame you had to deal with that at all." It's 2024, for crying out loud. You'd think we'd be past this by now. Adrian chuckled softly. You'd think. But change takes time, and sometimes it feels like progress comes in inches rather than miles. The man extended his hand. Thomas Blake, he introduced himself. CEO of a small tech company. I know it's not the same, but I've faced my share of people underestimating me because of my age or my ideas. What you went through. I can't imagine it, but I respect the way you handled it. Adrian shook his hand. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Every time we face these moments, we have a chance to shape how others see the world, and how they see us. The young woman in economy. Meanwhile, in the economy section, the young woman who had spoken earlier was writing in a small leather journal. She was a freelance writer, always looking for stories that carried depth and meaning. Today's events had given her plenty to think about. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where Adrian was seated. Her pen moved quickly as she jotted down her thoughts. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a reminder. A reminder that prejudice still exists, but so does resilience. A reminder that one person's dignity can challenge an entire system's complacency. Today, I saw courage, not in a grand gesture, but in quiet determination. She paused, tapping her pen against her chin. This wasn't just a story for her portfolio, it was a moment she wanted to share with others, a moment that might spark conversations long after the plane had landed. Adrian's reflection. As the flight neared its midpoint, Adrian leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the hum of the engines lull him into a meditative state. He thought of the passengers who had offered him words of support and those who had remained silent. Both reactions told their own stories. He also thought about Emily, wondering what she was feeling now. Adrian had no desire to see her punished. What good would that do? Instead, he hoped she would take this as an opportunity to grow, to see beyond her biases and assumptions. Adrian's thoughts turned once more to Carla Torres, his old instructor. He smiled as he recalled her final words to him on the day he earned his pilot's wings. Remember, Adrian, the sky doesn't care what you look like. Neither should the world. The sky was vast and open, a place where differences faded into insignificance. Adrian couldn't change the world in a single flight, but he could be a part of the change. As he opened his eyes, he looked out at the horizon. Somewhere beyond that endless expanse, a destination awaited, not just for this flight, but for society as a whole. A horizon of change. The flight continued smoothly, but beneath the calm exterior of the cabin, the undercurrents of tension and introspection persisted. Passengers were deep in thought, and whispers of the earlier incident flowed like a current through the aisles, carrying fragments of emotion, embarrassment, anger, admiration, and shame. For Adrian, the journey had become an unexpected opportunity. He'd come aboard as a passenger, hoping for a rare chance to relax and reflect, but the day had turned into a lesson, not just for those around him, but for himself. As the aircraft soared westward, Captain Bryant emerged from the cockpit and made her way toward Adrian. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes carried a depth of understanding. Captain Coleman, she greeted, addressing him with the respect she knew he deserved. Do you have a moment? Adrian set down his book and nodded. Of course, Captain. Bryant glanced at the passengers around them, many of whom were openly observing the interaction, then gestured toward the galley. Let's talk somewhere quieter. Adrian followed her into the galley, where Emily stood waiting, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly together. Bryant stepped aside, allowing Emily to speak first. Captain Coleman, Emily began, her voice trembling, I owe you an apology, a real one this time. I judged you unfairly. I made assumptions based on, well, I'm ashamed to admit what they were based on. It wasn't right, and I'm sorry for how I treated you. Adrian studied her for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. He could see the sincerity in her expression, the vulnerability in her posture. Thank you, Emily, he said at last. Acknowledging the mistake is the first step. The next is making sure it doesn't happen again, not to me, not to anyone. I understand, she said, her voice breaking slightly. I'll do better. I promise. Bryant stepped forward. Captain Coleman, I'd like to formally apologize on behalf of the airline as well. What happened today was unacceptable. I'll be filing a report, and I'll make sure this incident is addressed appropriately. Adrian nodded, appreciating the gesture but knowing the true test would be in the actions that followed. I appreciate that, Captain, he said. But more than reports or apologies, what I hope for is change. The kind of change that reaches every corner of the airline industry, and beyond. Bryant inclined her head, her expression resolute. You have my word that I'll do my part. The passenger's response. When Adrian returned to his seat, a ripple of movement spread through the cabin. Passengers turned to watch him, their expressions ranging from sheepish to admiring. A middle-aged woman in the row ahead leaned back slightly to catch his attention. Excuse me, Captain, she said, her voice soft but earnest. I just wanted to say thank you. Adrian raised an eyebrow. For what? For standing your ground, she said. For handling everything the way you did. It reminded me that staying silent in the face of injustice only makes things worse. I won't stay silent next time. Adrian gave her a small smile. I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to make a difference. Nearby, the young writer had been listening. She scribbled furiously in her journal, capturing the exchange and adding it to her growing narrative. One voice, she wrote, can spark a chorus. The unexpected moment. As the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Adrian felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning, he saw Thomas Blake, the CEO who had introduced himself earlier. Captain Coleman, Blake began, his tone confident but warm. I know you didn't plan for today to unfold this way, but you've inspired more people than you realize. I've been thinking about how I can use my own position to create change. If there's ever anything I can do to support initiatives for diversity or equity in aviation, or anywhere, please let me know. Adrian shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Thomas. It starts with awareness and grows with action. I appreciate your willingness to take that step. Blake nodded. The world needs more people like you. Landing with purpose. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, the weight of the day began to lift. Adrian watched the city come into view, its sprawling streets and glittering skyline a reminder of the vastness of the world and the potential for change within it. The moment the plane reached the gate, passengers began to gather their belongings, but many paused to offer Adrian words of encouragement or gratitude as they passed. Thank you for everything, Captain. You're an inspiration. You made us think today. Adrian accepted their words with humility, knowing that the true measure of this day's impact would unfold in the days, months, and years to come. A new beginning. As Adrian stepped off the plane, he felt the sun's warmth on his face and took a deep breath. He wasn't just stepping into another city, he was stepping into a new chapter. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to an old friend in aviation advocacy. We need to talk. I've got an idea for a program to address bias and promote inclusion in our industry. Let's make it happen. Hitting send, Adrian felt a renewed sense of purpose. Today hadn't been just another flight, it had been a journey of growth, reflection, and determination. As he walked through the terminal, surrounded by the buzz of travelers going about their lives, Adrian felt a quiet certainty. Change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And he was ready to lead the way.